set.
Okay.
Welcome everybody to tonight's spoken history webinar. I have 3 of you right now. If you have any technical issues, we've had a couple of ourselves today, go ahead and put that information in the chat. And if you have any questions for Don, we'll hold those to the end. And if you put those in the Q&A section underneath, then I will let him know. Thank you. And take it away, Don.
Okay, thanks much. Can everybody hear me okay? It's coming through? Must be. All right. So the title of the talk is The Impact of the 1872 Wisconsin Central Railroad Extension on a Developing Northern Wood County. And I don't know if it's the best title for this talk, but it's what I came up with when I was getting it ready to start with. And so we're going to talk a lot about the history of Wisconsin, then the development of the railroads in the 1870s, or this particular railroad in the 1870s, and a little bit about what it meant to the area. And I have a problem here. Let's see. There we go. I guess I'll have to do it that way. All right. So in order to start this, I thought I'm going to go back to the beginning and talk about the origins of Wisconsin, kind of go through Wisconsin's early history leading up to the 1850s and then the 1870s when the railroad came through central Wisconsin. So anyway, when it comes to the early history of Wisconsin, it's important to know that Wisconsin was part of the Northwest Territory. And the Northwest Territory is pictured here in the green. And it was, when it was created, they established state boundaries. The Northwest Ordinance also prohibited slavery north of the Ohio River, and it defined the path to statehood. Basically what it did is it made the process a 3-step process to become a state. First off, the territory was created and the president would appoint a governor, a secretary, and 3 judges to represent the area. Once the population reached 5,000 adult white males, women weren't counted in the census originally, and the Native Americans that were in the area at that time also weren't counted. It was only the adult free white males that were counted. Once that number reached 5,000, then the territory could elect a legislature, and the legislature could draft a constitution, prepare to become a state. And when the population reached 60,000 people, then that constitution could be shared with the voters in the area. If they approved it, then it went to the Congress, and the Congress would approve it before the territory became a state. So in Wisconsin's case, we are part of the Illinois Territory, the Indiana Territory, the Michigan Territory, and then in 1836, we became part of the Wisconsin Territory. The Wisconsin Territory was actually larger than the area colored in green here at one time. The borders of the boundaries changed over the years before we became a state. But what you see today is actually what was approved for statehood back in 1848. So I mentioned the steps to becoming a state was a process. And the first step was that you had to reach a population of 5,000. So it was important to have territorial census records kept. And the first census in 1820, there were 1,444 free males. 10 years later, that population had increased to 3,635. And then by 1838, you can see the population has grown significantly, and we're at a population of 18,149 individuals. So in 1836, we'd reached that threshold to become a territory, and we were made officially a territory. Michigan in 1837 would be applying for statehood, and so as they were applying for statehood, the Wisconsin Territory was formed from what was left of the Michigan Territory. And you can see how the population grew. In 1840. It was 30,945, and by mid-1840s, it was up to 150,000. So in 1846, the legislature prepared a draft constitution that was shared with the voters in 1847, and they voted it down. And there was a couple reasons, but mostly they thought that it was too liberal for their point of view. And so in 1847, the first constitution was voted down. And then the following year in 1848, they went back to the drawing board and created another constitution that was shared with the voters, and that constitution was approved. And it was sent to the United States Congress, and on the 30th, well, we became the 30th state on May 29th, 1948. And by 1850, just 2 years later, the population of adult free white males was actually 305,391. So you can see that over the course of those 30 years, 1820 to 1850, the population grew significantly. And today the population of all the citizens of the state of Wisconsin is 5.9 million. Now, one of the things I wanted to kind of show you is that Wisconsin might have been something different when it comes to looking at a map. And so this is a map of a portion of the Wisconsin Territory. Wisconsin Territory actually extended as far west as North and South Dakota, included all of Iowa and the rest of Minnesota. So what we have for a state out of the Wisconsin Territory is really what we're familiar with today. But when that territory first was created, there was an area known as, well, down here, it was a 61-mile strip of land that covered the south part of Wisconsin today. It actually included the city of Chicago. And in 1818, when Illinois was applying for statehood, again, we had these steps that each territory was supposed to reach. The state of Illinois, when they were applying, didn't have that population significant enough to apply for statehood. And so the Congress included what they referred to as Nathaniel Pope's 61-mile strip in the Illinois configuration, which increased their population, and then they became a state. In 1835, excuse me, Michigan was over here, and it had a small piece of property between Ohio and the state of Michigan that both of the states wanted to claim, and it was referred to as the Toledo Strip. And it was just a small piece of property that extended from down here and came over to the point of Indiana. And what they talked about was Michigan wanted to keep that, Ohio wanted to keep it. So Congress made a proposition that the Upper Peninsula of Michigan would be given to the state of Michigan in exchange for that territorial strip. And so that was approved by Congress in 1835, and we have what we see today when it comes to the state of Michigan with the Upper and the Lower Peninsula. And then in 1840, when we were starting to talk about statehood for Wisconsin, they took a section north of the St. Croix River, and this would be the boundaries of the St. Croix River, and actually provided that or gave that to Minnesota. So the boundaries of what we know as Wisconsin today are the same boundaries that were created by the time we became a state in 1848. Now, when it comes to the early history, again, I mentioned that we are part of the Michigan Territory, the Illinois Territory, and the Indiana Territory. In 1820, we were actually part of the Michigan Territory, and we had two major counties in what became Wisconsin, and then the Upper Peninsula here was a third county. Part of it's in Wisconsin and part of it's eventually part of Michigan. But looking down below here, we can see the black county lines in 1820 for Brown County and Crawford County. And then they extend up to the north here where the county borders were. What's important about this first picture is when you're looking at this picture, you can see that there were only two counties for the state per se, Brown and Crawford. There was also only two communities at that time. In 1822, you had the Green Bay area, which is Wisconsin's first city, and at the time, the largest city. And then you had Prairie du Chien down here on the Mississippi River as the second community. And for the most part, all the European settlers in the state at that time were in those two areas. I want to show you this map of Wisconsin's waterways for the fur trade, because I think it's important to understand the importance of the lakes and rivers to the development of the state. So you can see Wisconsin here, and crossing Wisconsin are a number of fur trade routes, and each of them are actually connected to different waterways. When it comes to the early settlement of the state of Wisconsin, the waterways were the important ways to connect the community, the state, to other communities. And so what we see here are different fur trade routes that extend from the Great Lakes, Canada, and then head down to the Mississippi and connect to the St. Louis and other markets in the South. The waterways were important for transporting individuals and moving goods and supplies to and from the different points. In 1835, this is the main waterway between Green Bay and Prairie du Chien. And in 1835, they connected, or the three forts that were prominent in the state at that time: Fort Crawford at Prairie du Chien, Fort Winnebago at Portage, and Fort Howard at Green Bay. And so they put in a military road, and the idea was that the military road was a backup. There were times that transportation by water was not reliable. The water was down, it was frozen. You depend on that for transportation. So the military road was put in alongside the rivers to actually facilitate easier travel at those times when the river or the waterways weren't available. Now, when it comes to Wisconsin settlement, when you look at a map of Wisconsin, the first thing you notice is that Wisconsin settled from the south north. And that makes sense when you think about the things that were going on in the area. Southwestern and southeastern Wisconsin in 1822 is actually kind of where things get started. In the southwestern part of Wisconsin, we had the lead mines, and everybody's probably familiar with the story about Wisconsin badgers and the fact that miners would come into the area, dig small, shallow holes for one or two people, and that's how the miners got the nickname the Badgers, and we carry that tradition on today. And then on the southeastern shores of Wisconsin, along Lake Michigan, you had settlements forming too. Milwaukee was getting a start. Solomon, Juneau was down in that area. It didn't become a city or a major city until the 1840s, but the early the beginnings of the community were already down there. And then as the shipping became more prominent on the Great Lakes, then you started to see settlements form in other places along the border or the lakeshore of Lake Michigan. Now, migration and immigration were important for the early settlement. You had Yankee immigrants, people who were already in the United States, coming in and settling in southern Wisconsin. And you also had European immigrants coming. As they came to the country, they would travel via the Erie Canal over the Great Lakes and actually make their way into southern Wisconsin. attractions. There's always things that attract people to a community. One of the things that attracted people to southern Wisconsin was that the price of land was reasonable at the time, $1.25 an acre. And then the lumbermen started moving into the areas on the rivers and establishing sawmills. Up by De Pere was the first sawmill in the state, and that was in 1809 along the Black River. And I have my glasses on, but I can't see it right now. Along the Black River, you had John Shaw establish a sawmill in 1819. And then along the Wisconsin River, Daniel Whitney down by Port Edwards, Nakusa area, built the first sawmill on the Wisconsin River. And so the lumbermen were starting to move into the area. The problem was at the time, when we start talking about the time frame 1822 to the 1830s, is it was Wisconsin territory, but the technical ownership of all those pieces of property weren't necessarily able to be given to individuals. The reason for that is because this was all Indian land at the time. And so in the 1820s, when the lead mining was going down in the southwestern part of the state, there was actually some problems with Native Americans. We had Euro-American immigrants coming in to mine in southwestern Wisconsin. They were taking the resources that had been used by the Native Americans. The Native Americans hadn't given up the rights to that property. And so there was some issues related to ownership of the resources, ownership of the land, and having Euro-Americans settling in that area while it still belonged to the Native Americans. In 1827, the Winnebago War or uprising occurred, and it was a really short little conflict. But it was such that when it was over, the US government basically compelled the Ottawa and the Potawatomi to sell that portion of the land to Wisconsin and move west across the Mississippi. So you start to see land successions being given to the government. Now, this map is important because in a treaty that occurred in Prairie du Chien in 1825, the US government and a group of different nations of Native Americans got together and talked about what the boundaries were in Wisconsin for each of the different tribes. And this is kind of a schematic representation of those areas that were defined. Now, the Native Americans said they weren't hard and fast borders, but by establishing these, the federal government could go back and negotiate with each of the different individual tribes to purchase the land and force Indian removal to the west of the Mississippi. And so what you see start happening here in this time frame is in 1829, there's negotiations with the Chippewa and the Potawatomi. Then in 1831 with the Menominee, 32 with the Winnebago, and so on until 1848, when the majority of the land in Wisconsin is transferred to federal ownership, and the Native peoples are forced to move to the west of Mississippi. Now, in 1832, the Black Hawk War is fought, and it's the same thing. It's a short war. But once the war is over and the United States government, quote unquote, wins, they use that to compel the the Winnebagos to sell their properties. And so you start to see the Winnebagos selling in 1832 because of that. But once the United States had ownership of the land, then the next thing they would do is they would come in and survey it. And once it was surveyed, then they could start making that available to settlement to individuals who wanted to come in and buy it. And I probably put the slide in the wrong place, but we're going to talk about it just for a second. There are a number of reasons why people came or wanted to come to Wisconsin. First is access by transportation. For years, the waterways had been the major source of transportation, and then the tributaries. And it was the same way for whether you were talking about the logging businesses in Wisconsin. The lakes and rivers were important. When those were filled with settlements, then people started to extend out to the tributaries. Once the roads were started to be formed, military roads, 1835, I think I mentioned, there were some plank roads that were put in. And then after 1850, in the southern part of the state, there were small railroad lines also put in. So access to transportation was an important factor that influenced settlement in Wisconsin. And then there's all these things that we think about as far as good reasons to move someplace. In central Wisconsin, for example, we have all sorts of resources, the wildlife, minerals, trees, everything that's available. Wisconsin Central came into this area. They went all the way to Ashland to get up to the iron mines. And then we had all the forest products that were, or the standing timber that was available through the areas they crossed also. They also provided good, affordable farmland to support families. In 1863, the Homestead Act went into effect January 1st, 1863, and it gave people who wanted to purchase land at a reasonable rate with the provision of living on the land for 5 years and improving it, the opportunity to purchase that land at a very affordable price. It provided good jobs, better paying jobs than what were available in other places. Because of the territory here, there was plenty of food. For the immigrants who were coming from other countries, the Germans, for example, when they settled in this area, they had the opportunity to pursue their religious faith without being bothered. Because the Native American problems had been solved in the 1830s or early 1830s, it was a peaceful area to settle. And so people looked at it as a good place to start over. And then their friends and family, once they got here, oftentimes enticed people who still remained in the old country or somewhere else in the United States to also migrate or immigrate to this area. By 1865, the southern part of Wisconsin was seeing quite a bit of settlement. I showed you the 1848 map. This one is a map of 1865. And what's on here is also not just the townships and stuff. What you see here is the railroads. And so we know that settlement started along the waterways, along the rivers. But when it came to settlement, once people were in the area, roads started to develop also. And so we had roadways extending from the southwestern part of the state to the southeastern part of the state. They were carrying lead supplies to the Milwaukee area. They were carrying supplies from Milwaukee to Prairie du Chien. And so then as those roads were being developed, you would see more settlement by the different people coming into the state. And then you also start to see settlement along railroads. You can see some short railroad lines in this map. Chicago and Northwestern actually extends from down by Kenosha, comes over to Janesville, and from Janesville goes up to Fond du Lac, and then eventually to Green Bay. And then you have some smaller railroads in there too, the Milwaukee and St. Paul Railroad Company. You can see the lines kind of running in on this map on the southern part of the state. And then there's a number of other small railroads down in the southern part also. So in the early 1850s and that time frame, then you start to see railroads developing on the southern part of the state where settlement had already occurred. But this area here, this part that we call central Wisconsin and northern Wisconsin, remained pretty well untouched until the railroad, the Wisconsin Central Railroad, was proposed. And the Wisconsin Central Railroad is unique in that it's one of the land grant railroads for the state of Wisconsin. And it was actually established or being built as kind of a part of the outcome of the Civil War. The Civil War was just ending in 1865. The Congress was worried that the British, who had remained neutral during the Civil War, but kind of supported the Confederacy, might come from Canada to attack the United States. You know, we've got to remember this is only 50 years after the War of 1812, so we are still a little nervous about the British. And so the idea was that Congress wanted to have a railroad line built from southern Wisconsin to northern Wisconsin that could move troops and supplies to the Canadian border quickly. And so because of that, the Wisconsin Central, or what became the Wisconsin Central Railroad, was actually one of the land grants railroads for the state. It also, at the same time, opened up all sorts of untapped resources in northern Wisconsin to be used for development. So just, the talk isn't about land grants, so I'm going to just kind of talk briefly about this. But what happened was, when a land grant railroad was established, the U.S. Congress would specify the route. They wanted it to go from Portage to Ashland, and they would specify that that was the way it was going to go. The state legislature would then select a railroad company to build the railroad. And after that railroad company is selected, the railroad would go in and do a survey to establish the route and file the definite location of where the railroad would go and through what pieces of property with the General Land Office. Now, as a railroad, land grant railroad, the railroad would receive from the federal government pieces of property within, at one time it was 6 square miles, and then it was later increased to 10 square miles on each side of the railroad line. And so what you get is this kind of checkerboard pattern of land, and what they would give is alternating squares. Odd numbered sections went to the railroad, and the even numbered sections were retained by the United States government. And so when you look at a railroad line that's a land grant, you should be able to find evidence that these pieces of property, these alternating squares or sections, were given to the railroad to help pay or recover the cost of putting that railroad in. Now, the 1856 and 1864 land grants, for some reason, didn't include the right-of-ways for the railroad property. There were some that did, but in this case, they didn't. So the railroad actually had to go out and secure the right-of-way of that property. And then Congress would make provisions if, for some reason, that they weren't recouping enough cost from the sale of the property, that they could go back to the federal government for replacement lands. And there were a number of different court cases when it came to the Wisconsin Central Railroad on recouping the cost for building the railroad. Now, the railroad that was identified to build the railroad line from Portage to Stevens Point, from Stevens Point to Ashland, was actually a railroad called the Winnebago and Lake Superior Railroad Company. And it was actually building from Neenah, Menasha over also. And so what ends up happening is the newspaper reports a lot of things about the process that's going through to get these railroad lines established. In 1860, the Winnebago and Lake Superior Railroad Company was incorporated, and it's reported in the paper. In 1866, they changed the name, and so that's reported in the paper. And every time something is changed, it gets reported in the newspaper. And what happens here with Winnebago and Lake Superior Railroad is it goes through a series of name changes, mergers, to end up in 1871 as what we know as the Wisconsin Central Railroad. That's the railroad that extended from Neenah-Menasha over to Stevens Point, and then from Stevens Point west up to Ashland. And building a railroad was actually kind of a step process. Everything, follows steps. The first step in the process after the railroad is selected is to survey the property. You want to identify that course that you're going to take for laying the tracks between point A and point B. Second part is to go in there and clear the land, and it means taking down the trees, means pulling any of the stumps out, basically getting the land ready to put the tracks down. Because there are some areas that are not real smooth, you have to grade it. You smooth the high spots down, you fill the low spots, and that's part of the process. And then the last step is to actually lay the tracks. And for the Wisconsin Central, the process started over on Doty's Island in Neenah-Menasha, moving toward Stevens Point in 1871. And then in the spring of 1871, the process is continued west of Stevens Point toward Marshfield and then up toward Ashland. And at the same time, they're moving south or building south from Ashland this direction, kind of like the transcontinental, meeting somewhere in between to form one railroad system. Now, one of the things that I should mention is that while we talk about the construction process, all of these things are actually going on at the same time. They survey quickly, and once the survey is accepted, then they start clearing the railroad property. And while we talk about them west of Stevens Point in 1872, much of the area that was going to be used for the railroad coming through this area in 1872 was actually cleared in 1871. So the Portage, Winnebago, and Superior Railroad, again, I mentioned that this was the one of the 4 land grant railroads in the state of Wisconsin. And you can see the map here points, this little hash mark here is the Wisconsin Central going up to Ashland. And they started to do the survey on June 14th, 1869, and they completed the survey September 25th, 1869. And basically they go through in the articles in the newspaper talk about that this is a wonderful piece of property. It's vast agricultural, mineral, manufacturing resources in the northern parts of the state. And so we know that in 1869, they've gone through, assessed the property, and really set the course of the railroad between Stevens Point, between Neenah-Menasha, Stevens Point, and then Ashland. Now, one of the things about this that I think is important is to emphasize the number of people that were working on the railroad. No matter where you run across articles when it comes to the railroad, it talks about large numbers of people working in each section. And so just over the course of 1872, I pulled a few ads that were appearing. I thought it was interesting that Chicago seems to be the big place where they were advertising for employees. And what I like is they need 1,000, then they need 1,500, then they need 3,000. We're talking large number of employees that we're going to be putting in the railroad. And they worked hard, and they received between $2 and $2.25 per day. Teamsters got more. And then board was included and transportation was included. And so what I think is important to know is that one of the impacts of the Wisconsin Central Railroad was bringing people, the workers, into this area. And I believe that some of those workers actually would work for a summer and find a piece of property along the railroad that they liked and claim it as a homestead. And that's what happened in one of my families. is that they worked in the summer of 1872. 1872, November of 1872, they homesteaded a piece of property at the end of the railroad line near Unity that year. Now, Stevens Point was the first piece of the track that was laid. And in November 15th, 1871 is when the first train of cars reached the Wisconsin Central Railroad depot, or over the Wisconsin Central Railroad at Stevens Point. And there's big news write-up about it, talking about the celebration they had, because Stevens Point had been promised a railroad for a number of years. And it wasn't until 1871 that the line actually came into Stevens Point. And then the same article talks about the work that had been done west of Stevens Point already. It says the road is grubbed and cleared for 40 miles west, with 600 grade men at work on every section. And again, just thinking about the number of people working on the railroad, clearing the land, grading it, laying tracks, you can see how much work was going into building this railroad at the time. Now, when it comes to the early railroad stations in central Wisconsin, one of the things is that a lot of these communities didn't have names when the railroad was first coming through, or they hadn't all been established. And so a lot of times when you're looking in the newspapers, or if you're looking through records, you'll see them referred to as mile sections. You know, I'm going to use Marshfield because Marshfield's my hometown. Marshfield is located 32 miles west of Stevens Point. It's referred to as section 32. And then if you continue north on the Wisconsin Central line, Spencer's at 40 miles, Unity's at 63, Colby's at 51. Sometimes the mileage is varies. You'll see different things reported for the same area. Actually, section 51 and 53 are Colby, and section 23 and 25 sometimes refer to Auburndale. So it's not a hard and fast what the community number is or the section number is, but generally it's talking about the approximate miles distance from Stevens Point. Now, when it comes to the next part of work for Wisconsin Central Railroad from Stevens Point, again, in March of 1872, they started constructing the railroad from Stevens Point west. And at the time, you know, we know that when they lay track today, they always put a layer of gravel and stone down first before they put the railroad ties on. And then they put more ballast between, more gravel and stone between the railroad ties before they put the track down. In 1872, I don't know for sure what the construction was, but this picture here is an 1874 railroad line in southern Wisconsin. And I know by 1875, it was standard practice to be laying ballast between the ties. So I'm assuming that they were laying ballast when they were building the railroad through central Wisconsin. But that means hauling an awful lot of gravel from Point over this way. And so the first thing just to mention is that when it comes to the construction, first you have to clear the land, then grade it. And then when you're laying the ties, you're also laying the wooden ties down and then putting the rails on top of it, spacing the rails and filling those spaces between the ties with ballast. Now, one of the things here is that this railroad was supposed to have reached Colby by September of 1872. Now, it doesn't say it's, well, I think it does say, and I'll hit that in a minute. When it comes to the Wisconsin Central Railroad, one of the things they were good at doing is when they hit milestones, is they would take a group of people out to inspect the railroad line. In this case, when the railroad hit Auburndale in August of 1872, there was a large excursion. They had the government officials, railroad officials, construction crew officials ride the line out and see or inspect the line and then look at the territory that they were going through. And it ends up being reported in a number of different papers in the state. This article came from Superior Times. It was mentioned in the Wisconsin State Journal, I think the Menasha paper and others about these events. And so what did they have to say? Well, first off, they said the railroad excursion extended from Menasha to a point in the wilderness called Auburndale, about 25 miles west of Stevens Point. Again, this was the first week in August of 1872. And it says that it's the present terminus of the track. And that's important for those of us from Marshfield, because in Marshfield, we have a tradition about the first railroad passing through town July 4th, 1872. If they weren't to Auburndale until August of 1872, and Marshfield is beyond Auburndale, they weren't here for the July 4th, the traditional July 4th that we think of as the anniversary of when the first railroad came through Marshfield. On this particular excursion, they had 33 state officials participating, railroad officials, and then the railroad builders. Phillips and Colby were the construction company that were putting in the railroad tracks. And again, as I mentioned, they officially listed that this was an inspection excursion. They actually had a formal meeting at the end of the trip and passed a resolution talking about this, how substantially built the track was, how the rolling stock was the finest, and first quality is the word they used. And then they passed that on their way back to Menasha. They actually had this meeting while they were on the train. So one of the things I think that's important in their little conclusion was that expectations as to the character of the country through which the road passes were more than realized. A heavy and varied growth of timber, evidence of good soil were found above Stevens Point, notwithstanding previous skepticism of some parties as to the worth of that region. Misapprehensions concerning northern Wisconsin are bound to go down before the facts. So what they're basically telling people is that everything that they had said that was positive about reasons to build this railroad track north and the resources that they were going to be able to tap were true. They were finding a lot of things to be positive about. Now, I mentioned that part about Auburndale on August 10th. And one of the problems we have when we look at some of these historical newspapers is that the Marshfield Times, which was the first Marshfield newspaper, didn't formally begin until 1879. And the earliest edition of that paper that exists is actually 1882. So when it comes to really looking for things, firsthand accounts about events in the city of Marshfield itself, you have to depend on what's written in other newspapers or what people relayed later as far as messages go. And so this is a 1972 anniversary issue for the city of Marshfield, talking about 1872 being the first railroad coming through Marshfield. And again, it says on July 4th, according to tradition. But again, if it didn't get to Auburndale until August 10th, it couldn't have been here on July 4th. The story is the same though. Regardless of the date, the people who were probably present when that first railroad train or locomotive came into Marshfield was Louis Rivers, his wife, their daughter Della, his brother Frank, and Mr. and Mrs. Pete Johnson and their daughter. That part is probably true. It's just that the date over the years has become a tradition, but it may not be 100% accurate. So when did the railroad reach Marshfield? I guess that would be the next question. And what we can find is in a Saturday evening express Menasha in 31 August 1872, regular trains are now running to a point 32 miles above Stevens Point. Stevens Point and section 32 it's Marshfield and Stevens Point. And so by the end of the month, we do have the railroads coming to Marshfield. And then a week later, they're talking about them going 35 miles west of the city. So they were probably up in the Manville area at that time. Now, when it comes to the railroad, one of the things that can't be stressed enough is many of the communities along the Wisconsin Central Railroad wouldn't have been here without the Wisconsin Central Railroad. So when you look at a plat map for Wisconsin, for example, and look at all the different townships, what you can see is that where the Wisconsin River comes through, the southern part of Wisconsin, you have communities that are established much earlier than those on the northern part of the county. And so here we have Rudolph, Grand Rapids, Wisconsin Rapids, Port Edwards, all kind of the 1850s as far as times when they're being established. And then Milledore, Auburndale, and Marshfield following the path of the Wisconsin Central Railroad and being established at those times. And then when you start moving away from the line, again, you can see that the townships that are south of there would have been settled a little bit later. And so you can see the difference in the dates that way. Now, Lincoln over here is unique. Why is Lincoln at 1861? If we're looking at the railroad coming through here in the 1870s, why did Lincoln's get established earlier? And the answer to that is really the Yellow River. The Yellow River was a river that provided means for transportation in and out of the area. And so that area was settled first earlier because of the river. When it comes to those northern Wood County townships, Milledore, Auburndale, Marshfield, we'll kind of just talk about them a little bit. In a lot of ways, they're very similar to one another. They were established at the same time, more or less the same time. I know the anniversaries are celebrated at different times, but they're all related to the railroad coming through that area. And that really prompted the settlement. And so in Milledore, when you look at the town history for Milledore, it lists the three earliest settlers as George Hopper, James Brenner, and Barber Smith. And one of the things that I think is unique about those is out of the three individuals listed as early settlers in that township, two of them are homesteaders. And so what I've done is I've pulled up the homestead records from the Bureau of Land Management, General Land Office records site. And you can see that in this case, this is Barber Smith's record. He applied for the property as part of a homestead original land claim. And the same with George Hooper. He also applied for land underneath the Homestead Act. Now, I don't remember the dates, but it would have been after 1870. And it was very common in some of these townships to start to see homestead claims made by people who were either working on the railroad or individuals who followed the railroad to come in and settle an area. Now, one of the things that's important is these may have been workers on the railroad, they may not have been. But one of the things that's important is that you look at who platted the village. In this case, the village of Milledore was platted by Phillips and Colby Construction Company. The Phillips and Colby Construction Company were the builders of the Wisconsin Central Railroad, and they platted the land that became the village. And so it's quite likely that they received that land as part of the land grant, and then they established the village plat to start recouping some of their costs in establishing the railroad. We also know that that area was settled by a number of Bohemian residents. And again, what I mentioned was that people tended to write home and talk about, the good property they had and things like that. So relatives and friends from the communities, whether they were here in the States or overseas, would follow the families later on and come and settle in the same area. And then because Milledore, like Auburndale and Marshfield, were wooded areas, you start seeing the first industries coming into this area as a result of the railroad coming through here, the building of sawmills and stave mills. And the one thing about Milledore that I know when I look at some of the historical recollections of the community was that there was a stave mill built there in the early 1870s, and it operated until the standing timber was gone, and then that company packed up and moved someplace else. But one of the things that's nice about the railroad is that the railroad provided the means for bringing in the equipment to make staves, and was able to transport that product out of the community back to wherever it happened to be needed. Shipping was really important in the early development of communities for the railroad communities. The second township over is the Auburndale Township, and here we look at a piece of property that was settled similar to Milledore and similar to Marshfield, about 1870, 1871. And the first settlers that are listed are a guy named William St. Thomas and then John and Robert Connor. And the Connors actually purchased enough of the property and laid out the plan for the village. When the village was incorporated, that was all done by the Connor family. They operated a store to start with in Auburndale, but then when the sawmill that had been there or had been established there in 1874 was for sale, the R. Connor Company purchased it. And from there, the rest is history. R. Connor became a very prominent lumber industry, and they followed the timber, the available standing timber, north until they ended up in the Leona area, Forest County. And they had sawmills in Stratford. There's a Connor Corporation in Wausau, Leona. But anyway, the Connor lumber industry actually had its foundation in Auburndale. And again, I think in some ways, the important thing to know here is that you had a businessman that could see the possibilities or the potential of the area and capitalized on that, and then actually moved the operations further north as one piece of property became exhausted as far as standing timber. Then he would move further north to capitalize on available resources. The one thing that should mention with the Connor property, he had a large piece of property in Auburndale, and he had the family farm or the company farm there, which produced a lot of the meat, vegetables, and things that were used for his stock and his employees in the different lumber operations. And then when it comes to Marshfield, Marshfield was established in Township 25 North, Range 3 East. Again, it's a French-Canadian hotel owner that came to Marshfield. The story goes that he purchased land. Some places say he was given land. I believe he did both, that he may have been given land by the Marsh family to establish a railroad depot. But this is the only place where I can say that I found evidence of someone saying the land was given to an individual to establish a railroad depot. In a history sometime in the 1880s, Rivers had said they negotiated kind of a price, and it sounded like he was not happy with the price. So I think he probably purchased the property from the Marsh family. I have not gone and really looked to see what I could find on that yet. But tradition has it that he was given land to build a railroad depot, but it's not a tradition that's seen in lots of other communities. And again, tradition also says that he arrived here April 1st, 1872 to build that hotel, so that when the railroad crews came through, he would be able to provide hotel accommodations, a saloon, grocery store and things like that where people could come in and do business. If he didn't come to Marshfield until April 1st, 1872, he missed a year's worth of business. And I don't have the feeling from what is known about Mr. Rivers that he wasn't here earlier than that. In the 1881 history of Wisconsin, he said that he was here in April of 1871, which would make more sense because that would have been when the crews were going through to clear the land and grub it clear and grub it and then start leveling the land. And so in all likelihood, he actually was here a year earlier. And again, he came with his wife, Mina, their daughter, Della, a brother, Frank, and one of his workers from the hotel in Nisita, Gabriel Adolph Lupient, whose family still has connections here in Marshfield. Now, the first building that he put up was what's referred to as Marshfield's first hotel. It was a log structure over on the corner of Chestnut and Depot Street. And besides being a hotel, it served as a restaurant. His wife would serve meals there. It served as a store. The people who were working on the railroad or the community members who were coming in could purchase supplies there. In 1872, he applied for a post office and was made the postmaster for the community, even though he couldn't read or write. It also served as a saloon, a school, and then the first Catholic church services in Marshfield were actually held in that building until the church was built. Now, one of the things that I think is important, again, has to do with the character of the individuals that were attracted to the different communities. Louis Rivers could have been, talked about being Marshfield's first lumberman because he did hold considerable timber properties. For those familiar with Marshfield, if you go north of town, out to the McMillan Street, and when you turn right on McMillan off of Central, that entire area, Section 25, Range 3 East, Section 5, was his. And supposedly that had a nice quality of hardwood standing in that area. When Louis Rivers came to Marshfield, there was no sawmill here. And so he would cut the timber, cut it into logs, and then ship it either to Stevens Point or De Pere to have it cut into lumber. It didn't take Mr. Upham, who follows him to Marshfield, long to put in a sawmill. And I think he may have had a good business sense when it came to hotels, but as far as really setting the tone for development and seeing where a community could go, he didn't have that same caliber of thought that Mr. Upham had. And then the other thing about Mr. Rivers is that this nice, valuable piece of property was actually lost in a dice game with a guy named Sanders. And both he and Sanders ended up in the poorhouse. And the story here talks about the fact that Louis Rivers at least got out of the poorhouse. And he just walked away. It's not that he paid his debts. Now, the Rivers house, this is probably neither here nor there, but one of the things that the railroads did was they increased the transportation in and out of communities. And Marshfield became a thriving community relatively quickly after the railroad came through here. And in 1883, Mr. Rivers put up a 3-story hotel on Central Avenue, and it was referred to as the Rivers House. This article appeared in the Wood County Reporter, so Wisconsin Rapids, talking about the building being built. In the picture here under number 4 is actually a picture of the 3-story Rivers Hotel. It was built in 1879, and in the winter of 1883, it burnt to the ground. And One of the reasons it burnt was because it was 26 below zero that day, and there was no water to carry to put it out. So they watched the building burn as they emptied it out of furnishings and things. That picture of the hotel actually came from this bird's eye view of Marshfield. I think this is an important image of Marshfield. When you think about in 1872, when the Wisconsin Central Railroad came through here, this was all standing timber. There was no buildings. There were no buildings in this area at all. And one of the things the railroad did was it opened up territories to development. And Marshfield's a good example of a thriving little community in the 1880s. You can see all the smokestacks in the pictures. All of those represent different businesses that had been established in this central Wisconsin town. Most of them, if not all of them, are probably related to some type of wood product industry. In the corner over here, in the upper left-hand side, you see that first smokestack. That would have been the stave heading mill. You come over here to the right side, you have the Upham sawmill, then you have the Upham furniture factory, and then back here on what would have been Oak Street and 4th is the alcohol plant. And so those are all things that would have been using wood products. And so when you see the community developing and businesses developing, one of the things that were important about Marshfield was the diversification. There were a variety of different businesses going. They may have all used wood products to start with, but it was the diversification that helped strengthen the community. I mentioned Upham. This is a picture of Mr. Upham. In 1870, he was actually up in Angelica, Wisconsin. He didn't come to Marshfield until 1878. When he got here, the first thing he did was he opened up a sawmill and a mercantile store on Central Avenue. And then over the next few years, he added other businesses. And so we got 78, the sawmill and the store, 79, the planing mill, 82, he starts the furniture factory. Furniture factory ends up being the last standing business of his up until 1924 when he passes away. It operated until the later 1920s and then was taken down during the Depression for work projects process. And then he had already kind of seen that there was going to need to be a transition from the wood products industry to agriculture. And in 1885, he had put up a grist mill. Now, besides his connections to the community as far as businesses go, he was also on the city council, served as the mayor, and he served as the 18th governor for the state of Wisconsin. I wanted to show this picture just to kind of point out those three businesses I talked about. Over here, you have the furniture factory. This is Mr. Upham's house here. So the 2 is the furniture factory, the 1 is the sawmill, and the 5 is the alcohol plant. So what happened was in the 1880s, because Marshfield had the railroad line coming through here, and we can see that it encouraged people to start putting up different factories, again, having to do with the transportation of businesses or products in and out. You have the stave and spoke factory, you have dry goods stores, general stores, hardware stores, hotels, clothing stores, drug stores, and of course, being Marshfield, you had to have at least 15 saloons. But what's important here is that the railroad actually spurred this development. It encouraged the development in the community because it could bring people to and from the community. So when it comes to talking about the impact of the Wisconsin Central Railroad on northern Wood County, and just using Marshfield as an example, it provided resources, raw materials that had otherwise been landlocked. They weren't close to rivers, so the standing timber stood in this area. When you go up to the Govebic Range in northern Wisconsin, you had the iron there. The railroad permitted the transportation of iron products in and out. The railroad laborers that came through and built the railroad also were provided an impact on the early community, because not just my great-great-grandfather worked for the railroad and settled homesteaded land in Unity. Other railroad workers did the same, where you can see that people who were following or working the railroad lines in the 1870s were also kind of falling off the crews and establishing homesteads along the railroad path. And then the jobs, when it comes to the early impact of Wisconsin Central Railroad, since the major resource in the area was standing timber, and it could have either been softwood or hardwood, you found that the businesses that were established started producing wood-related products. We'll talk about lumber first. It's simple. They take the logs. Once the timber is cut, they take the logs back to the sawmills, cut it into lumber, and then ship it out to be used at different points. Some of it also stayed in the community and was sold. As the standing timber, quantities of standing timber, the resources diminished, then they started going into other products. Mr. Upham, for example, took raw products, made it into lumber first, then he took the lumber and made it into furniture. And so you see wood-related products other than just sawn lumber. You also see things like the stave heading mill, where they were connecting or building, or not, building's not the right word, making staves for barrels. So you see different products that are related to the wood industry being produced here and then shipped out to other areas to be made into barrels and things like that. And again, like I mentioned with Mr. Upham, as the wood products or the lumber industry started to diminish, as the standing timber dwindled, then you saw a transition to more agriculture-related products and businesses related to that. So what was important is that the railroad provided easy transportation for bringing supplies into the community, and also provided the opportunity for exports out of the community. The exports, when you think of all these different businesses manufacturing things, they had to have a place for their products to go to be successful. And then the same thing is true about the transportation. The transportation permitted things to come into the community. And so what we ended up having in Marshfield was a good source of commerce. People could bring things in for the stores that might not be available in other places because of the direct route between Wisconsin, or the central part of Wisconsin, and, for example, Minneapolis, St. Paul, or Chicago and Milwaukee. So Marshfield had a nice supply of things that they could put in the stores, the hardwood stores, the dress stores, the hardware stores, things that they could use to sell people in Wisconsin. And up until this point, we've only kind of talked about the one railroad, with Wisconsin Central Railroad. In the 1890s, and I'm not a railroad expert, in the 1890s, some major changes happened when we extended a line east of Marshfield over to Greenwood. And we also had the line that extended over to, Neillsville. And so you see railroad tracks coming up from Wisconsin Rapids, then tracks going west of town to really form what became the hub of Wisconsin, where railroad passage in Marshfield was really important. People would come to be going to Wausau, for example, and have to travel to Marshfield. Because Marshfield was this hub of the state, it allowed for commercial businesses to flourish, the hotel business to flourish. In the early part of the history of Marshfield, people would come for different meetings and celebrations, the annual meeting of the Eagles, of the United Commercial Travelers. All those things tended to occur in Marshfield because it was a central location where transportation was easy to make the trip to Marshfield, because we were the hub of Wisconsin. And again, Friends and Family is on there by mistake, but I think one of the things that the railroad also did was it kept us connected to other communities. When it comes to families, it was easy to visit other family members that weren't in the area. So you see people leaving Marshfield when they get older. Say a kid that grows up in Marshfield in the 1880s, 90s, leaves town, and you will see him come back to Marshfield to visit, or family or friends going to his house or to his home talked about in the paper when they go to visit him. So friends and family and the railroad still go together, even though that wasn't really intended to be there. So with that, I guess I'm going to stop. I don't know how long I've been talking. The Wisconsin Central Railroad is probably the most important thing that happened in the development of the city of Marshfield. Northern Wood County, it was very important for Milledorf, for Auburndale. And then when you proceed north from Marshfield towards Ashland, it's equally important, as each little community along the railroad path depended on that railroad going through for its creation or it being established. And while the original intention was for the Wisconsin Central to be completed in 1872, 1873 was a bad year for railroads, and the railroad didn't connect to the northern part until I think it was 1879. So, but it was eventually completed between Neenah, Menasha, and Ashland. And with that, questions? I don't know if I can see them.
I don't have any questions in the Q&A yet, so let's give people a minute or so to put some questions in. Don, I did want to say you had a typo on your first slide.
Well, okay.
It says 1848, and then it says 1948 is when we became a 30th state. So
okay.
It's a typo.
Thank you. I will fix that.
I thought you might be giving this another time, so you might want to fix that. And it looks like I still have no questions. Let's give people another minute or so and okay.
Well, if there's no questions, thank you for the opportunity to talk. We will probably be doing another talk on railroads next year with someone who really knows a lot more about the railroads, specifically in Marshfield and where they were established and things. Keith Meacham is going to be giving a talk sometime during 2022 about that.
And our program for next month is actually going to be a spoken history. A woman is going to portray and talk about the life and times of Laura Ingalls Wilder.
Should be good.
Should be a good program. So inviting you all to come back for next month's programming. Okay.
Well,
thanks everybody.
thank you.
Bye now.